Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into the intellectual world of C.S. Lewis. And I mean, really plunging in, going beyond, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and even beyond his famous arguments for faith.
Right.
We're looking at the specific academic soil he grew in, Oxford and Cambridge.
Exactly. We've got a fascinating stack of sources for this.
Hmm.
There are excerpts from a literary biography that really map out the intellectual currents flowing through those universities when Lewis was there.
Literature, philosophy, religion.
Science, the arts, all of it. Plus a biographical overview, hitting the key life points. And some really intriguing research, actually, on how simply being near other writers geographically can impact their work.
Fascinating. So our mission then is to take all this material and, well, synthesize it. We want to understand the specific environment Lewis was in day to day, the fiery debates he dove into, the ideas he championed, and the ones he absolutely tore apart.
He certainly did that.
And crucially, how the very places he spent his academic life might have shaped his incredible output, especially, in those earlier years when he was really finding his voice.
Yeah, think of this less like a lecture on Lewis's ideas and more maybe like a guided tour. You're with us walking through the libraries, the common rooms.
The lecture hall.
Right, where he wasn't just writing in isolation, but constantly talking, arguing, and really sharpening his thoughts against all the other minds around him.
Okay, let's unpack this. So when Lewis first arrived at Oxford as a student, and then later when he became a fellow, the main English program, the honor school, it was still primarily focused on language.
Very much so. Deep dives into Old English, Anglo-Saxon, the roots. It was a very linguistic foundation.
Right.
Now, there were moves certainly to bring in later literature, like, the 19th century and optional subjects. But that core, it stayed heavily linguistic for a good while. Our source actually points out Lewis himself took 3 language papers for his degree.
And he was a fierce defender of that approach, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely.
He felt really strongly that you just couldn't truly understand English literature without knowing that fundamental history of the language itself.
Exactly. He saw the university's job as providing that depth, that continuity, something, different from what you might get in secondary school.
And that foundational perspective, it really informed his later critiques, didn't it?
It really did. He was quite outspoken against certain trends in contemporary literary criticism that seemed to just, disregard this historical and linguistic grounding.
Like his pushback against figures like I.A. Richards or F.R. Leavis.
Exactly. Take Richards. Lewis felt Richards proposed some, really questionable standards of taste.
Right.
But even more fundamentally, he just rejected Richards' idea that literature's main value was therapeutic.
Therapeutic.
Yeah, that you read it primarily for psychological benefit. Lewis's reaction was basically, if that's all it is, I'd stop reading. He felt it just missed the entire point.
And then there was that group, the Vigilant School of Critics.
Ah, yes, the Vigilant School. They were known for having a pretty narrow view of what counted as, valuable literature. They often disparaged works that didn't fit their specific moral or spiritual criteria.
Okay.
And here's where it gets really interesting for Lewis and his circle. They tended to dismiss escapist genres.
Like fantasy, science fiction.
Precisely. The very genres Lewis and Tolkien were writing and, would become globally famous for.
Wow. So he wasn't just having abstract academic debates.
No, not at all. He was defending the very kinds of imaginative literature that meant the most to him and his friends. The literature he'd contribute so much to. He directly challenged that narrow critical view.
It wasn't all just fighting there. He had those well-known debates, like the one with E.M.W. Tilliard over Paradise Lost.
Right. That was a spirited discussion, definitely, but apparently quite amicable. It focused on, the specific interpretation of the text.
And it shows the environment allowed for that kind of rigorous debate without sort of destroying collegiality.
Exactly. Because Tilliard was later one of the electors who actually offered Lewis that prestigious chair at Cambridge. So, clearly no lasting hard feelings there.
Okay. Moving beyond literature, the philosophical landscape. That was also undergoing some pretty seismic shifts.
Oh, massively.
When Lewis started at Oxford, idealism was still a significant force, right? And people saw it as quite compatible with religious belief.
It was, yes. But that was rapidly changing. Idealism was being pushed aside, first by realism, this idea of a world existing independently of our minds.
Okay.
And then later by logical positivism. Now, this is a big one, championed by figures like J.R.R. at Oxford, Bertrand Russell from Cambridge.
And what was their core idea?
Essentially, they argued that the only meaningful statements were those that could be empirically verified, tested by science, or were analytically true, like math or logic definitions.
Right. And that must have felt like a direct challenge to religious claims, or even things like ethics or aesthetics.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Lewis saw this as a philosophy that basically tried to empty out theology, aesthetics, morality, reducing them to purely linguistic issues, arguing that statements about God or beauty were essentially meaningless because, well, you couldn't empirically prove them.
He tackles that somewhere, doesn't he?
He powerfully satirizes it in that hideous strength. You see it through the character Mark Studdock and his experience in the objectivity room at NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments.
Ah, yes. He saw it leading towards nihilism, a kind of meaninglessness.
Exactly. He felt it tried to twist the mind into an impossible shape by just denying vast swaths of human experience and thought as, well, meaningless.
It's fascinating then to look at his own philosophical journey and the groups he was part of, like the Magdalen Metaphysicals at Oxford.
Right, who were they?
Well, it was a group that included figures like R.G. Collingwood. And what's striking is that while a lot of Oxford philosophy at the time was moving away from any connection between philosophy and theology, this particular group seemed almost, well, driven towards belief by their philosophical investigations. It's quite a contrast.
And this provides the intellectual backdrop, then, for that really pivotal conversation he had in 1931.
With Tolkien and Hugo Dyson?
Exactly. About myth and metaphor. The conversation that led to his conversion. They helped him see that the mythic patterns he found so compelling intellectually.
Like the dying and rising God.
Yeah, that those weren't just psychological archetypes, that in Christianity it had actually happened.
Yeah.
In history, through Jesus Christ. A truly transformative moment, intellectually and personally.
Okay, so shifting to the broader religious scene, the period after World War I, it saw a lot of despair, obviously. But our source also highlights something called a Christian Renaissance in literature.
Yes, there was a definite shift away from the more liberal, modernizing theology that had been prominent towards a more traditional sort of neo-Orthodox approach, influenced by figures like Karl Barth over in Europe.
And Lewis became a really central figure in that revival, didn't he? Even though he wasn't, a professional theologian or a clergyman.
It's quite remarkable. It's noted that in terms of widely shared conviction and actually influencing people's beliefs, no formal theologian at the time was half as important as Lewis.
Wow. And he was known for defending traditional Christian doctrine quite robustly.
Very much so. He debated figures like Archbishop William Temple, and perhaps most notably, he critiqued modernist biblical criticism, sometimes called the demythologizing approach.
Right, the attempt to strip out the supernatural. Figures like Rudolf Bultmann.
Bultmann, yes. And later, Bishop J.R.R. Robinson, who wrote that controversial book, Honest to God. Lewis really challenged their methods.
How so?
He argued they applied a level of skepticism to biblical texts that they just wouldn't apply to other ancient literature. He questioned their whole project of stripping away the miraculous or supernatural elements from Scripture.
He insisted the truth claim of Christianity was the most important thing, didn't he? Not just whether it was psychologically helpful or had a good social program. That's a key point in mere Christianity.
Absolutely, which of course came out of those incredibly influential BBC wartime broadcasts, reaching a huge audience during a major national crisis.
Yeah.
So what are those paradoxes mentioned in the source, though? Lewis, this absolute powerhouse voice in the mid-century Christian revival, apparently had very little interest in liturgy and was generally pretty silent on the sacraments.
Interesting. Now, beyond the academic and religious spheres, the historical and political currents were obviously undeniable. Lewis served in World War I.
Yes, experiencing its horrors directly. And the interwar years saw huge political shifts at Oxford, just like everywhere else. Lewis expressed his opposition to totalitarianism quite early on, actually, even in his poem Dimer.
And then World War II just brought it all home.
Completely. He tried to re-enlist, served in the Home Guard. He even had refugee children staying with him. You can only imagine how that must have profoundly changed his perspective on the world and on childhood itself.
And some of his most impactful works dealing with evil and suffering, like the Screwtape Letters.
Written right during the war, often during its darkest periods for Britain. And the famous BBC talks, too, which became Mere Christianity.
Right.
He also critiqued appeasement before the war started. He argued that making peace the absolute highest goal was, well, mistakenly prioritizing a second thing, something valuable but not ultimate, as if it were the first thing.
That's a very Lewisian way of putting it.
It is. Though our source also notes, fairly that while he was incredibly sharp on many things, he wasn't really a specialist in economics or math. And sometimes, that showed in his commentary.
Okay, and then there's the engagement with science. Now, Oxford was historically stronger in humanities compared to Cambridge's science focus, but science was growing there too.
It was. And Lewis engaged directly, not so much with science itself, but with scientism.
Scientism.
The belief that science is the only valid way to understand reality. He devoted figures like the eminent biologist J.B.S. Haldane and the astronomer Fred Hoyle.
How did those debates go? Did he hold his own?
Oh, definitely. He actually, quite cleverly, used Haldane's own argument against him. Haldane had pointed out the problem of evolutionary naturalism producing unreliable thought.
Okay.
So Lewis basically turned it around and said, well, if our minds are just the result of random physical processes shaped only by survival, how can we possibly trust that they reliably discover truth, including the truth about evolution itself or physics?
Ah, that's clever. Using their own logic against their broader worldview.
Exactly. He also critiqued the tendency to sort of extend evolutionary ideas way beyond biology into a grand narrative about absolutely everything. He called it developmentalism. And he argued that science, just by its very nature, couldn't prove or disprove miracles, because miracles are unique, unrepeatable historical events. They're outside the scope of scientific experiment.
And he was also a strong opponent of vivisection, wasn't he?
Yes, very much so. He portrays it incredibly negatively in that hideous strength.
So, putting it all together, Lewis was constantly in dialogue, often in really heated debate, with all these intellectual currents across multiple disciplines in his time.
Precisely. He wasn't writing in a vacuum at all. His work was a direct engagement with and often a reaction against the specific ideas circulating in the very specific environment he inhabited.
And that environment itself, it's worth considering more closely. Oxford, particularly in the, say, 1920s and 30s, was really cementing its status as a world-class university.
Well, absolutely. It was attracting international scholars. It had significant resources. It was just a dense hub of intellectual activity, a powerful ecosystem.
And Lewis gets elected a fellow at Magdalen College when he's just 27 years old, right in the thick of it.
Right. And Magdalen itself had a really strong academic reputation. Lewis was deeply involved, not just in the college, but across the university in various groups.
Like the Magdalen Metaphysicals we mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
the Mermaid Club for reading Renaissance drama, and perhaps most famously the Inklings.
Ah, the Inklings, yes, a crucial informal group, meeting regularly with figures like Tolkien, Charles Williams. They'd share their works in progress, critique each other, fuel mutual inspiration. I mean, the influence Tolkien and Lewis had on each other's fantasy writing is legendary.
Absolutely. And he was also heavily involved in the Socratic Club later on, wasn't he?
Yes, he led it for many years. And that was a vital forum specifically for debating the truth claims of Christianity. He'd bring in prominent thinkers from other fields.
Like who?
Leading secular philosophers like H.H. Price, C.E.M. Joad, who was also a really well-known popularizer of philosophy in Britain at the time. These were intense, public, intellectual sparring matches.
Wow. It really sounds like a vibrant, sometimes contentious, but definitely highly concentrated intellectual and social ecosystem.
It absolutely was. And it's interesting, our source notes that while Lewis felt Oxford and Cambridge shared a lot, he described Cambridge, where he eventually moved later in his career, as having an atmosphere of unbelief that was noticeably more militant and strident than what he'd experienced at Oxford.
Interesting distinction. Okay, let's try and connect all of this to that fascinating research we looked at on localization effects among authors.
Right. This was the study empirically investigating how being in these geographical clusters, these communities with a high density of other writers, might actually affect an author's career.
And what were the key findings, the ones relevant to Lewis's context?
Well, a couple of things stood out. First, the study suggests that the sheer quantity of peer authors nearby really matters.
Just having more writers around makes a difference?
Apparently so. And crucially, the potential benefits seem strongest for authors who are under the age of 40. Essentially, when they're in those critical, formative stages of their careers. Being in a dense network like that can significantly impact how much they actually write and publish.
And Lewis was elected fellow at Magdalen at 27.
Exactly, putting him squarely in that key age bracket.
And he was deeply embedded in multiple intense intellectual communities. The Inklings, the Socratic Club, the college environment, the wider university debates, precisely during his most prolific period at Oxford, when he wrote so many of his foundational works, both academic and popular.
It lines up remarkably well. The research also brings up this idea of crowding out in these dense clusters.
Crowding out.
Yeah, like a competitive dynamic, especially among younger authors, vying for attention or connections. And when you think about Lewis, well, he was certainly known for his vigorous participation in debates, his sharp wit, his willingness to take on big contemporary figures.
You could definitely see that intense engagement fitting within the dynamic of a competitive, vibrant intellectual hub.
You could, yes.
So the question this raises for Lewis then is, did being in this specific, highly concentrated, and fiercely interactive environment actually fuel his prodigious output? Did it fuel the intellectual battles he engaged in, particularly during those earlier defining years?
Did that network of peers, collaborators, opponents, did it push him, challenge him, provide the intellectual friction that helped sharpen his arguments and develop his ideas?
That's the core of it.
The research strongly suggests that being in these kinds of clusters, especially early in your career, can be profoundly impactful. Now, obviously, we can't draw a simple cause-and-effect line and say Lewis couldn't have become Lewis anywhere else. That's impossible to know.
That's
But his experience elected Young into a top college, immediately immersed in these incredibly dynamic intellectual and social groups. It aligns remarkably well with the idea that location, peer interaction, and being part of a dense intellectual ecosystem likely played a significant role in shaping his trajectory and productivity, particularly in that crucial early period.
So what does this all mean for how we understand C.S. Lewis today when we pick up his books?
Well, I think it means that understanding Lewis isn't just about reading his books in isolation or, viewing him as some lone genius developing ideas in a quiet study somewhere. It's about recognizing that his ideas, his arguments, his creative output, they were forged and sharpened in the crucible of constant interaction, often intense debate, with his contemporaries, within the unique geographic and institutional settings of Oxford and Cambridge.
So his writings are, in many ways, responses to
Yeah.
engagements with that world.
Exactly. Responses to, engagements with, and critiques of the vibrant, often contentious intellectual world he lived and breathed every day.
It really adds a whole new dimension to his legacy. Okay, here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. How much of C.S. Lewis's enduring impact was due solely to his individual brilliance and conviction? And how much was actually a direct product of the specific dense network of thinkers, friends, and opponents he was embedded with at Oxford and Cambridge, particularly during that formative period of his early and mid-career? Could his particular unique trajectory, could it have happened anywhere else in the world?